Okay, so what's going wrong with rugby union in Australia? Now, this World Cup so far for the Australians has been nothing short of a shambolic disaster. I think that's the best way to describe their current World Cup. They beat Georgia in a scrappy win. They lost to Fiji, which isn't actually a surprise, really, with how Fiji have been playing in recent years. Fiji are a very, very good side. Let's not knock Fiji's achievements, but on paper, Australia should have that with their depth and their clout within the game, you would think. And then the defeat to Wales, a record-breaking defeat to Wales, one of the worst defeats the Wallabies have ever had. It's also their worst defeat at a World Cup ever. But I think the issues start in the 1990s, early 2000s, when they are the best team in the world. Domestically in Australia, they put Super Rugby and Rugby Union Test matches behind subscription TV paywall. So automatically, you already have a sport that is already seen as pretty elitist, with the upper echelons of society playing, which is not necessarily the case because working class, people do play and support the game. But in Australia, they put everything behind a subscription TV paywall, which is stupid. You've already cut off, especially those of lesser means in society, from accessing the sport that, as I say, is stereotypically seen as middle to upper class with participation. They also decided in the late 90s, early 2000s to start attracting rugby league talent over from the NRL into their system. So I'm going to use the examples of Rogers, Takiri and Saylor. Now, those three players all played in the World Cup final in 2003, and they were an integral part of the side for several years. Now, at the time, the NRL in Australia was going through some financial difficulties. We had the Super League war, where the rival Super League and the New South Wales Rugby League, which was renamed as the Australian Rugby League, were battling over the future of the game, and that had financial consequences. And Rugby Union saw that as an opportunity to get some big-name Australian sports stars into Rugby Union to help with increasing the appeal of the sport by getting working class lads from Rugby League into Rugby Union, and also bolstering their side with some superstar power for the commercial aspect. They have continued with this policy of attracting rugby league players over from the NRL into the Australian setup. Joseph Suali'i will be the latest player to sign a lengthy, expensive contract with Rugby Australia at the end of the next NRL season in 2024. He will become a Rugby Union player for their drive for the 2027 World Cup. But in one of these cross-code internationals, they had a bit of a problem a few years back, and we covered that almost to death on this channel, and that was Israel Folau and his controversy surrounding his social media content and his political and religious views on said social media. Now, in the mid-2010s, Ryling Castle, who is a New Zealander and formerly a netball executive, was appointed as the head of Rugby Australia, and her tenure was a disaster. With all the off-field scandal involving not just Israel Folau, but several other players of a high-profile nature, there was a lot of litigation. The Israel Folau situation cost them millions of Australian dollars and cost them sponsorship, cost them money. She obviously eventually got booted out the door, but this policy of paying massive centralised contracts to rugby league talent to lure them over from the NRL and get them into the Wallabies system and the Super Rugby system is that money could be better spent at grassroots level. There is an issue with grassroots level where they're actually losing talent at youth level to rugby league and Aussie rules football. So that's the NRL system and the AFL system in Australia. And this has been going on for quite some time. Some of the best NRL players, for example, Cooper Cronk is a prime example of which I will use, played rugby union at school at grassroots level. And Cooper Cronk, one of the best halfbacks the NRL has ever seen for the Melbourne Storm and the Sydney Roosters, one of my favourite players. Can you imagine Cooper Cronk as a fly half or a scrum half wearing the Wallaby gold and green? Absolutely you can. But he was lost to rugby league. That's a prime example. But they attract Israel Folau over to rugby union, and it while Israel Folau is no doubt a very talented athlete and a very multi-skilled athlete who's played multiple sports, it didn't really work. And then you look at the NRLW, the women's version of the NRL, and again you look at the amount of ex-rugby union players who've played and represented Australia at World Cups and in the Sevens, who are now playing rugby league. They're even losing female talent from their system. So there's clearly a talent drain out of rugby union in Australia to the rival codes. And then you look internationally. Uh, Mac Hansen for Ireland is Australian born. He's playing on the wing for Ireland in this World Cup and has had a fantastic World Cup. Fantastic. You look at Major League Rugby and you look at some of the players who are playing in Major League Rugby and also in the leagues across Europe, who realise they can get paid more playing in France, playing in England, playing in North America. They can get paid more, which makes them eligible for selection for the Wallabies because they haven't met the Matt Giteau rule threshold of a number of caps before they can play overseas for selection. So now they're losing really talented youngsters and talented players who could play test level to the European and North American leagues where they can get paid more. They can get a better salary because the pay is not good enough. And part of that is they're putting too much into these centralised contracts and trying to lure rugby league players over. So the Joseph Suaalii contract, I mean, that's raised a lot of eyebrows in rugby league circles within the NRL fan base. It's very divisive. It's a very divisive topic in NRL fandom. We're looking at around $1 million plus Australian dollars on a centralised contract to lure him over. $1 million plus Australian dollars. Now, the NRL operates with a salary cap. They operate with a salary cap. But surely that money they're offering Joseph Suaalii could again be pumped into the grassroots game, the community game, trying to encourage, players from working class backgrounds to take up the sport, to break up this stereotype of this elitist upper class sport that's played at private school. They could engage with Queensland, New South Wales and Western Australian state education, the state schools, in order to play the game, because they are seen as not great at the community level. The domestic game isn't great. The Super Rugby franchises, the Super Rugby format has changed. Obviously, COVID had an impact, but the Super Rugby franchises aren't particularly successful. The Western Force pulled out of Super Rugby at one point, citing funding issues, and the same amount of money they needed to remain a Super Rugby franchise in the old format was the same amount of money that was given to Israel Folau on his stupid contract. So they've made some really poor contractual decisions. Again, putting the sport behind a paywall has cut off millions of Australians from viewing the game and seeing these players as heroes and wanting to emulate players of yesteryear like Gregan and Larkham, for example. You don't get that connection with the fan base, so the fans are already feeling a bit disenfranchised with the direction the sport is taking. And yes, while they've appeared in 3 finals and won 2, their last final was in 2015. The rot had already set in by that point, and the team hasn't won the World Cup since 1999. Yet this is one of the countries within rugby union that was pushing for professionalism in the mid-90s. And it hasn't really worked for Australia because, as I say, they're bleeding talent to the Northern Hemisphere leagues where they can get paid more, and that includes Japan as well. They brought in the Matt Giteau rules because Matt Giteau was obviously playing in France at the time and he was seen as integral to their World Cup chances when he was still a player. The selections for this World Cup also raised some eyebrows. They've gone with the youngest ever Wallabies team at international level with a squad. So it's their youngest ever team. And they've been humbled by Fiji and Wales. Now, Fiji and Wales are pretty good sides. Let's not knock Fiji and Wales here. Wales have got their own issues domestically, and they're a squad in transition, which is the scary bit. This Welsh side is not the best Welsh side we've ever seen. This Fiji side, because of the change of World Rugby selection rules, some of these Fijian players were playing for Australia, or New Zealand, not that long ago. There are some Fijian nationals playing for the Wallabies, who in theory could be playing for Fiji, but those Fijian players playing for the Wallabies, such as Vunivali, for example, are again those mercenary ex-NRL players. So Rugby Union Australia's been going wrong for about 20 years. I think the starting point was offering these stupid contracts financially and luring the rugby league players over to try and to sell merchandise. Really, it was more of a commercial decision. And don't get me wrong, Takiri, Rogers, and Saylor are all brilliant dual code internationals. There's no doubt on their quality on and off the field. Brilliant players. I grew up watching Gwendol Saylor and co playing league and union. I can appreciate what they bring on the field, but off the field, the structures, the old boys club, commercial decisions, the Israel Folau Ryling Castle era at the end of the 2010s, pre-pandemic, was disastrous. The collapse of Super Rugby, the initial format of Super Rugby before what we have now, was disastrous. And some of the decisions, I mean, they're still offering these big centralised contracts to rugby league players to basically plug the gaps that domestic rugby union in Australia is not producing. They're not producing the talent because they're losing the talent to league and AFL. And then they're trying to buy back the talent at a great cost after league, which has not really had to spend that much money developing these players. Cash is in, and they're costing Rugby Australia more to lure the talent back that they've lost 10, 20 years earlier in the development side of things. It's a revolving cycle, and I think there's going to be a lot of hard questions asked. Now, in regards to this current World Cup, Eddie Jones is not the saviour. The players were not happy when Rennie was sacked, when David Rennie was sacked. There is no doubt on that. The players that have been left back in Australia, could they have made a difference? Potentially in the Fiji and Wales games, there might have been closer games. They might have won those games. They might have had a better result on the field. But leaving Quade Cooper back at home, for example, and Michael Hooper has raised a lot of eyebrows with rugby union fans. They are that veteran presence on the field they need. They don't have a lot of veterans in the team. It's a very young team. So here and now, yes, you can criticise Eddie Jones and the selectors and the coaching setup for the current issues on the field. But Rugby Australia, just a few months before a World Cup, deciding to sack the coach and replace him with a coach who's been sacked by another nation, sounds like they're clutching at straws, hoping for a miracle, which is not going to happen. This is a long-term decline that has been exacerbated by really bad corporate and structural decisions that have been taken, and they're not clearly. Instead of investing in the mercenary rugby league players, why not invest that money in grassroots and trying to grow the game domestically? Because it's losing ground to, you know, rugby league and Aussie rules. So there we go. That's my view on why things have gone so wrong for rugby union in Australia. Place your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll have some more content for you very, very soon.